The slab roller compared to a rolling pin, for years that's all I used was a rolling pin, and it works just wonderful. Using different slats of wood, different sizes on both sides of the rolling pin so it hangs up on those, you can actually get a specific thickness on the slab. And you can start out with thicker slats and then go down to thinner slats and slowly compress both sides and get a pretty darn good slab that way too. So compression of the slab probably is best done by pounding. A double roller slab roller seems to compress both sides of the clay and gives you, in a way, a better slab for a variety of processes. But a single roller slab roller works great. I like to go ahead and cut off a piece off the block or the pug and just go over the basics of double roller slab rollers. You have some of them have a shear pin. You don't really ever want to bear down on the wheel. You may bust that, or you could hurt the gears too. So doing it in increments sometimes is a necessity, but making that pug piece of the pug that you cut off a little thicker than the actual thickness, not like substantially thicker. You can't just jam it through here. Alright, so you feed that canvas in and you pull it, and again, it shouldn't be too hard to actually turn this wheel. I should be able to do it with one hand. Don't ever bear down on it. And that gives you a nice, very even, compressed on both sides slab. Okay, with the slab roller, you don't want to start out with a big chunk of clay and try and crush it through there. You can hurt the slab roller and you don't get as good of a slab either. I'm going to show this technique using a mallet, an I Ching technique, to actually create kind of close to the length of the slab, or the width of the slab that I want. The length of the slab actually is going to be created more by the slab roller. Slab roller isn't going to really do much to the width. So I get it about the length of the rollers, a little less for the width of the clay, and then let the rollers get it the actual length of the slab I need. So I'm going to take this mallet, and in blacksmithing you learn that the way the hammer hits the metal is going to spread it a certain way. So if the hammer's hitting the metal with the peen of it this way, it's going to spread it to the right and to the left here. If I hit it this way, it's going to spread it that way. So first I'm going to do it that way. This compresses the slab really well too, right off the bat. Although the clay itself is pretty compressed. You see how the width of it's getting wider and wider. Okay, with this technique, of course, I could refine the slab with the flat part of the mallet without even using a slab roller. Alright, getting close. This is actually my template right here. So I'm looking at the width of it, trying to be that wide, and it's pretty close. So I'm going to paddle it up just a little more, or I can actually stretch it a little to get it to that point. This is better done with a little drier clay, but I actually want wetter clay for the slab because I'm going to manipulate the slab after I roll it on there. The newspaper template I'm using is actually marking the diameter by wrapping it around a form and showing me how large of a slab I want. I'm going to fold that area, and then I've been using that to actually measure out the slab that I'm making right now. And I can use a square to actually square that up and make sure I have it square, and I can measure that out so when I cut the actual clay I can use the newspaper as a template. Okay, the thickness of the slab of course could be whatever thickness you want. If you want to make it really, really thick so you can carve away at it, really, really thin to get translucency with some porcelain, you have to think about what the thickness is. Of course, on scale issues, if it's way too thin, you're going to have a little more problems dealing with it sometimes. It's going to dry out quicker so you can get to the next stage quicker. but you have to think about thickness in relative terms to what you're doing and the scale of the object. So if I was going to do this piece and I just was going to leave the slab the way it was, I don't think with this kind of diameter I would make it a ½ inch thick. Maybe with the scale of that tube I might make it 3/4 of an inch, but I'm going to go kind of thin because I want to work a little thinner with this, so I'm going to go a little bit more than a 1/4 inch. So I'm going to lay that in here. I've already adjusted the rollers to just a little more than a 1/4 inch. I'm going to take my slab, lay it into the canvas, just a little bit back. I don't like the canvas bunching up in the front. Sometimes that happens, so I don't like that. I'm going to push the canvas till I feel the rollers there, and I'm going to take that top piece, roll it down on top. And now I'm going to just pull this and push it in slightly until I feel it grab. There we go. And sometimes on larger slabs, they get hung up in here, so you may need a helper to pull this through, just in case if it gets hung up. Okay, I'm going to talk about some loose slab techniques using a male mold. So a positive shape of some sort that you can use as a form that you would be rolling or laying the clay over. So with this loose slab technique, you do need to resist the object that you're going to use. It could be round, it could be square. These are just some everyday common ones. When you put the paper on, newspaper or some kind of paper that's not real glossy, that's going to stick to the clay. So this paper, being just regular old newspaper, is going to absorb the water from the clay and peel off the clay on the interior of the form very easily. So I'm going to put it on there, and I'm going to put a small piece of tape in an area. The most important part here is that it slides on and off the form. So when you wrap that form, whatever that form may be, with paper, you have to make sure that the paper's not really tight on there. So it needs to slide off. So this hard object, again, could be a 4x4, or it could be some found object, even a bottle, a glass bottle, plastic objects, rectangular, square, or round. But the one major issue is that that form has to have some kind of way that it will slide off of there. So if it does something where it undulates, this is not going to be a technique you would use for that. This is showing that paper template over the slab, and now the slab can be cut around that paper template. I'm going to use the canvas to coax it on at first. Sometimes you can use a helper, but the material of the canvas I can pull up against this tube till it starts to roll. So I'm rolling it on. And when I see that edge up on top, I know I can put my hand then on it, let go of the canvas. So I'm wrapping it on there. It's fairly tight. Sometimes when I come to this end, I find like I left way too much clay, but again, it's better to leave too much clay than not have enough. Okay, I just have just right, about maybe a 1/4 inch extra overlap there, which is going to give me a little thickness in that seam area. I can do some reductive work to get rid of it, but as you see, this pressure, my hand on the inside of the tube against the two edges of this slab, this is where it's going to join it together. That pressure alone sometimes is just enough. So I've got it on pretty much affixed from the top to the bottom here, and I'm going to push down and roll. Okay, the seam's pretty fixed. I paddled it slightly. I'm going to paddle it a little more. Sometimes I paddle it towards itself, and this is only if it's really right on. If it overlaps a lot, I don't worry about it, and I just do some reductive. And now, fixing this surface, I'm going to roll it off the canvas and get it onto a smooth surface. Instead of it being in this tube, I can get my arm in there. I can just lift it up and put it anywhere I want. So there is a benefit to having a hole in the tube sometimes, and you can think about that when you're choosing your form that you're working with. Tools I like to use to work that surface, try and get this texture off of here. These flexible rubber or plastic ribs. I like a flexible metal rib for bigger ones, and this could be as a straight edge on square objects too. This little one that comes in all the cheesy kits that you get works really well too. So I'll use this. Everybody has that. And I like to moisten it slightly. I don't want it to drag and pull up too much clay. I also don't really want to change the shape too much. And I'm getting this surface off just by sledding, saying it's sledding across the surface. So sliding it across the surface on an angle. I'm not going to use it upright like this to it'll gouge into it. And this is compressing all that canvas texture off of there. Now another thing to think about is if you did clean this surface up, you could then take it and roll it onto a composition that you've created out of different materials, and it would then emboss that composition on the surface of this. While it's still in the tube, you can press against it. Got it all smoothed out. Now this is when it comes kind of a question of wetness in clay and girth or size of the piece before I flip it up. Because down here, if this is the bottom, or this could eventually be the top too, you could start on the top right away, like seal it off if you wanted to make an enclosed form. But it can sag down there as soon as I take the form out. So I'm going to gently get it on that angle, and then I'm going to slowly put it up there and allow that to slide down. It actually just got resisted from the paper and is not even attached to the tube. Now, this is where it comes into questions that I need to think about. Like if I'm going to keep it round, for instance, I might just take the tube out of the paper as to not to disturb the clay. It's sliding out, and I've got it out. And the paper, most of it came out with it. Quite often it gets hung up in there, and if you take it out now and you want to keep the integrity of that circle, you could disturb it. If you want to get it out right away, you can put your finger in there, grab a piece of it, and twist it. Don't just pull it straight out, because it might be hung up somewhere. So I got that out. Then I'm going to look at the seam and look at the integrity of that seam. And although I fixed it on the outside, I want to fix it in on the inside sometimes too. So let me show you the overlap of that seam. If you look down in there, the seam got fixed really well up here, and down there there's a bit of an overlap that I'm going to have to smear in towards the other side. Sometimes you have a little gap there. That's just an overlap down there, so that's better than a gap. But if you have a gap, you've sealed it up on the outside, you can get then on the inside with a small coil and fix that seam. Okay, I've worked that seam fairly well, smoothed it out, and I also went in the whole circumference of the tube and used a soft flexible rib and smoothed out any little dents that the paper may have bunched up and put a dent in there. Now the options here are thinking about, again, keeping it in a cylindrical, real straightforward form, or manipulating that form. If I'm going to manipulate the form, stretching it outward or maybe pushing it inward might be a problem too, but at least stretching it outward, I am going to think about that seam. So although I've made it go away, I did make a mark there so I know where it is. And I'm going to keep that mark in mind when I'm manipulating it. I can put it into a square right now, or any kind of shape basically, but I'm going to probably just show you a couple ways to push in, push out, play with the form. You can also cut away areas of the form and then squeeze it back together. A technique called darting and sewing is something to look into if you're interested in. There's three things that I've done to it now to alter the form. You of course have to start thinking about how the composition is going to work to pull the viewer over. Maybe there's going to be an image here that's representational that's going to be pointing that way, or take it so literally, but the way the form is going to work around the surface. So working that either on paper and planning your pieces out, or thinking about it as it evolves, is something that is somewhat of a necessity. Okay, I've worked the surface as much doing this pushing and pulling, and I'm going to do some additive work to it also, work some forms on it. You could think about carving into it. I'm going to put a lid on it and actually put forms then like that on the lid too. And I've already put a bottom on, so scoring, slipping, slapping it on the bottom. And on smaller ones, you know, picking it up and using pressure, like bouncing it like that, it's a good way to get the bottoms on. So I'm going to move into working on some smaller ones, and I'll go back to this one at the end. But with the smaller ones, I want to talk about darting and other altering techniques to make them turn one way or cinch in. Darting is a technique that's stemming out of textile industry. If you think about a waistline on a dress, cutting out leaf-shaped patterns around the circumference of something cinches in that area. So it's a way, again, to take that basic cylinder and alter it. With put a slab on the top of this cylinder, then cut a puzzle lid off of the cylinder. So what a puzzle lid is basically trying to figure out a way that you would cut a line that would create at least 3 tongues kind of on the lid or on the body of the vessel, and those would then lock in. Now locking in is the problem. So the idea of a puzzle lid, that would have to go on an angle this way. It couldn't like go like an actual puzzle piece, or you couldn't get it off. Although there's some real complicated puzzle lids. So what I did was I put that slab on the inside of this, attached it to the top of that cylinder, and manipulated it a little bit more by pushing in and pulling from the inside, from the outside, and then cut this off. Here's probably a little better example of pushing and pulling again on a cylindrical form, but then doing some addition work, utilizing other hand building techniques to work in form on the surface of the piece. I also wanted to make mention that, you know, if you have a longer tube, it doesn't have to just be one piece. So this is from this real small tube, and so I measured 5 inches up here, and I marked the line, and now I'm just going to cut it through, slowly spinning it here on the turntable until it cuts clean through everywhere. Okay, so now instead of one piece, I have 2 pieces out of that same process. Of course, you could do a really long piece of PVC tubing you get at a hardware store and do like 6 cups at the same time. So I'm gonna dart these. I'm gonna start out by actually starting where the seam is, but before I do that, I'm gonna finish the lip and put a bottom on them. Okay, I'm finishing the lip by kind of throwing it a little, smoothing it out, rounding it up a little so it's not that cut shape. I'm also going to get in there and just rib that interior too. Okay, I'm going to cut this bottom off here. Pretty much apply the slab by scoring, slipping, and using just a little bit of pressure. But I like to go back after I cut it off and make sure we've got it pretty well joined up. Sometimes I can flip it over and just paddle the bottom slightly. And then I might put it like on a turntable here and use a stiff brush down in the bottom, kind of again like the way my finger would act, to fix that interior seam. Okay, now I did flip this one over when I scored the bottom, so I'm going to probably just fix that lip just a little more. And now I'll get to the darting part. Now, since I know where the seam is here, I'm going to take this area and I'm going to cut just below where I might put a handle. Kind of a leaf shape out of there. Of course, the size of the shape and the different shapes that you can possibly choose are going to dictate where the clay is going to move to after you remove it. Alright, so after I remove it, I can take that area, score it, slip it, and I like to kind of score and slip at the same time, sort of, so I'm dipping my scoring tool in that water slurry. And then just pushing it, coercing it together like this. And I like to get that seam so it's more closed on the interior than on the exterior. Because I can fix the exterior easier, so I'm looking at the interior area. Okay, well, just that one dart has given this form quite a different appearance and movement than just a straightforward cylinder. When we look into the interior, I've worked that seam. Working that seam especially down in the bottom and along that joint is really important to keep that piece together. There's a lot of pressure on it wanting to kind of spring back. Okay, further alteration, I'm going to reach in there and kind of give it a belly the opposite direction of where it's going right now. So I'm just reaching in here and I'm just pushing out, trying to get that belly to come out. And I'm using this hard, large rib and reach down in there. Let's see what I got. Getting some kind of form change, and just a subtle change in form is enough. Now I'm thinking about how a handle may jump off of here and come back down. Okay, I finished off these two cups from that one cylinder. Squared off the tops a little. Do some surface work on them and they'll be finished. Technique finished and ready to go into the wood or the soda kiln. One of the easiest ways to work with slabs, in some ways can be the hardest. Just working free without any molds, without any templates, or templates with this combination of this technique. Just working really loose, basically, with a freshly rolled slab, pretty loose slab here. Clean off the surface, have it all ready, and well, this is a straight edge, so I'm using this as a tool, and I can just draw this through and get the bottom of this. And thinking about cylindrical or other shaped forms, starting possibly with a cylinder, I'm going to go and I'm going to cut a piece out, and then I'm going to manipulate it after I put it into some kind of form, some vertical type of form. That vertical form can be made vertically and laid down as a horizontal form, and vice versa. So you can think about it that way. What I'm going to do is just build a vertical form here, do some basic cutting to alter it, darting like I've talked about. Darting will be something that I'm going to use to alter it too, but basically making the form and then doing some reductive work to alter the form in a variety of ways, just to give you a few ideas. I'm just going to use this to kind of line it up, eyeball it. I want to leave some of this slab to actually use for possibly a bottom or a top or something. And I have a sense of what kind of circumference I'm going to get from this distance, but I don't know exactly, and you don't need to plan everything out exactly all the time. You can just go with the flow. And again, tools that are right next to you that have edges that you can use to try and get it close, that's giving me some kind of starting point. Again, I'm going to save these pieces for additive work on, again, the bottom, the top, or other things I might do here. So just, it's a loose slab, picking it up pretty gently, and then giving it a curve. I can think about this curve as far as maybe that's where I'm going to stop, right there. or maybe I'm going to pull it all the way around and attach it. Having some foresight and planning, of course, is always the best, I think, but you see the variety of things that can happen as you start thinking about it. Where it's going to go from here is going to be up to me. I can have a large open form that then I'm going to add a slab in between here, or I can have this come in and close up on itself. So, since it's wet clay, I'm just going to pinch that edge together, and I can certainly go back on the interior. I can add a coil to that. I'm just going to play with it that way right now. So I have this, basic shape that's going on here. You can see what's happening. It's got a curve. You see it from the bird's eye view. Again, this could be laid down. I could take it and alter it a lot more after I get this together. I could even take this edge and change it from this kind of teardrop shape to a rounded edge if I had taken those edges and overlapped them rather than pinched them together, and I'll show you that in a smaller one. Alright, so after I have that together like that, I have all these options to start playing with it. This I'm going to take and think about how this is the top or the bottom, how that can be altered just by cutting some pieces away. So I'm going to cut an angle off here. So I'm using these, I'm trying to cut these out the same, and I'm going to give it about 1.5 inches between each one. And after I cut these away, I can then close this in on itself, and I'll show you what I mean by it coming right onto the slab instead of overlapping or instead of coming point to point like that. And obviously what's happened, because I've taken that material away, is I've made this opening smaller now, and it's closing in on itself. So I'm going to work these seams, working rather quickly here, using the clay at its wet stage or looser stage. Certainly you can't do this at a leather hard stage. I'm going to turn it, work on this side now. And like I said, I might go in and I'm going to reinforce a lot of these joints with coils, and I'll manipulate this area a little more, and I'm going to put a slab on it and see what that looks like as the bottom of the piece, having it have kind of a belly. Okay, you're seeing that bird's eye view again and seeing what's happening with these angles as I'm just smoothing them out with a fettling knife. I have yet to put any coils in there or close that area up with a slab on the bottom. What I have here now is this form that, if I'm thinking about how these cuts have created those kind of facets here, I can also round those out, I can paddle them out. I'm going to leave it there. I like these facets, they're working with the form. I'm thinking about getting in and doing some pushing out from the inside here to shape this a little. And I'm thinking about how I'm going to maybe cut away some of this and maybe add a slab. Still thinking about this possibly being the bottom of the piece too. I'm going to score this right now. Get it kind of wet because it's drying out the edges. I'm working really quick here, straight from the slab. I'm going to get in here and fill these areas in with coils, fix those seams up really well, because getting at them right now is a lot easier than putting my arm in from this side. And then I'm going to flip it over and start working on the top. Got this bottom on there, I scored and slipped it. I'm paddling to get that pressure, not too hard because again it's pretty wet clay, and I'm paddling around, and then I'm going to flip it over and I'm going to cut around and cut this excess off. Again, you think about that excess as part of the piece too. If you possibly want to roll it up onto the piece to create a line that the clay itself, this slab actually kind of folds over and creates this foot under there. I can think if I'm going to do this separate piece off of here as a foot that maybe comes out, that maybe adds some more stability than this smaller foot. So there's a variety of things to think about here. Okay, I've got this coil. I'm going to lay down in there, and with a brush, not really my finger, I've got a longer brush, I can get down in there. I can lay that into this seam here, and I can push it where I want it with the brush, just like with my finger. And I'm going to work that seam and fix that seam and reinforce it, give it somewhat of a gusset in there. It's not that big of a coil. It's probably about the same diameter as this paintbrush here, so it's not going to change too much on the top when you look at it from the top. But it's important to fix your seams. Sometimes you can get away with just building and not having any problem with the cracking, but I like to have this added step here just for some security. Yeah, I've worked it pretty well. I've got the seam in here. I'm going to finish up down here after it gets a little stiffer, but I've cut most of that off. I'm going to work that seam more. I've gone in with a pretty stiff paintbrush and worked that interior seam where it's joined. Maybe I have to do a little bit more in there. And now I'm thinking about how I'm going to be maybe cutting away some from here. I've got this real sharp point edge there, and I've got this curve. It's still got that kind of shape, but there is a coil that's fixing this seam. I'm thinking about cutting away. I could cut all the way into here, cut down, cut over, add a slab that can play with that, or I can dart it. I'm going to play with possibly a dart, a feather shape, or a leaf shape like that, but probably from here to there to create some kind of concavity in this form. Right now, I'm going to get in there with this flexible rib and start pushing out from the inside. I'm going to do it very slowly, a little at a time. Again, this slab is pretty much just freshly rolled, and as I stretch it, sometimes there's little surface cracks that form, and that depends on the quality of your slab. This clay is stretching out slightly, and I'm going to either think about that texture as something that I like, or I'm going to erase that texture later on. But you can see in the profile here how it's creating this curve down here. I'm thinking about maybe another curve right here. So a small one here and a little smaller one here. I'm thinking about actually slumping a form that's going to fit on top of here, so there's a curve on top. Maybe cut an opening, have a handle, and do a spout. I worked a little protuberance here and one here. Again, I'm still going to cut in here some way, but first I want to do this for the top of it and pressure with this dry sponge to get a form that I can use as the top of the piece, and I can connect this in a variety of manners, and I'll demonstrate that once it stiffens up. But I'll lift that out, and you see that I now have this form that can then be attached. I'll lay that aside. I'm going to work on cutting through here and doing some negative space work in here for the handle to come in and have this area visually balancing this area. Okay, you see this area I've cut out already. I didn't want to pull it out quite yet, and I usually would of course work towards myself when I'm doing this. And it's quite sticky. Even though I cut it out, it's still wanting to stay in. And now this is the area that I'm going to seal up. I can score and slip this, and it'll probably have a better joint there, but again, the clay is wet. I'm going to start working down here first, and I'm looking down on it from the inside here. I'm slowly working it and pinching it like that. will add a coil on the inside again, even though I already had added a coil to this area. Now I'm going to add another one because I just cut it away, but I'm going to reinforce now this joint. Okay, now you're seeing what's happening here with the back profile. I'll fix this area up a little more, and then I'll add this part to the top. Okay, so I've finished up really filling in coils where I need to. I've smoothed this out a lot. I'm getting to the point where I'm going to put this as a top form on top of this. But before I do that, I really want to be able to get this spout on. I made a spout form that's kind of a frowny face on the top there and a big smiley face there, like a tongue spout. I'm going to go over this again here by just saying moisten my finger and round out that freshly cut edge because I don't want that sharp edge. I also have it tapered. It's a little thinner at the tip of the spout than it is back here where it's going to join to the piece. I'll lay it up, and maybe I even pinch this right now while it's still flat and get it gradated down to even a sharper spout right here. I'm going to curl it up, and I'm probably going to just leave this one open here. Okay, I've cut out and scored this area. I've also scored the spout here. I'm going to do it a little bit more to make sure there's some slurry on there. And I'm going to go back on here, make sure that it's wet, and then I'm going to attach it. Okay, I've got this spout attached here, and I have this part that has given me a line that's on the inside of this opening. I'm going to cut this side of that line about the thickness of the clay, and I'm going to score and I'm going to slip both sides, this side and this top part, this rim, and I'm going to attach those forms. All the time using this wet rib to really get that area that I'm trying to get back to a wet stage, even though this is still pretty much not much more than 15-20 minutes past the time I rolled this original slab. I'm still having that edge drying out on me, and so I need to get it back to a wet stage. Now I have this opening under here, so I can't press too hard there, but I can kind of pinch upward against it. I'm getting this on here. What I'm going to do now is I'm going to work this seam all the way around with slight pressure down. Again, trying not to press too much as to collapse down on the foot because it's still pretty wet down here. So I'm able to gently paddle that seam Okay, now I have this top on. I've worked that seam pretty well, and you can see how this is working from the bird's eye view. I've got a handle pulled, and I'm thinking about where the opening for this form is going to be able to fill it. Okay, I have this handle ready here, and like I said, that point, that teardrop shape there, that's something you've seen, and I think you have to think about how the handle's going to go on there, and I wouldn't just cut it straight. So I have to think about that shape, cut into the handle so the handle wraps around it. I'm also going to take and think about the angle I'm also going to take the knife on a certain angle when I cut this, and if I cut under it, it's going to drop down. If I cut on an angle this way, it's going to actually spring off of the form. And so I want it to kind of spring off of the form. So I'm going to cut like this. For that reason. So you see what I mean by the angle there. So that's going to allow it to attach to the form this way and spring off of it. Okay, I'm dipping my rib in some slippy water, and I've decided I'm going to place it below here so it springs up and then comes down to here. And so I'm going to score that area, get that wet. Again, this still is a pretty wet slab here. It's not really leather hard, so when I press into this slab, I'm going to have to be careful. So which is one of the reasons why the handle needs to be of a wetter state too. Can't really take a stiffer handle and attach it. I'm going to take the handle part and I'm going to score that part, get that ready, even though the handle's plenty wet. And I'm going to apply some pressure towards the pitcher here. Okay, I've got the handle on here, and now I have to think about where this opening is. I still have to work it a little bit, but I have to treat this pretty carefully. I still haven't really worked the bottom too much, but I am going to work the bottom a little bit more. And I am going to think about this opening here and the shape I want to cut out of here. I'm going to use a X-Acto knife. So I'm going to use this X-Acto knife to cut it out. I'm going to plan it out by thinking about the distance from here to here in the opening. And I'm also thinking about how it's going to relate to the actual shape. I don't want to have it drop in there. When I get to the end of it, gently lift it out. And then I do a little bit of fine tuning on that. So I'm going to look at that and I'm going to play with that shape a little bit more. I'm also going to get in here underneath this form and just fix that seam slightly. I don't feel like I need to add a coil. I paddled it pretty well, but I'm going to get in here with my finger primarily and just work that seam, and I'm going to look under there and make sure that it's all sealed up and looking fairly finished. So my last step here is to work on the edges here. Like I said, I don't really enjoy a freshly cut edge. It adds a sharpness that can chip, and visually I don't like it either. So I'm going to play with that edge, round that edge out, and the piece will be ready for surface work relative to slips or glazes. I'll probably use slips on it. Okay, I'm just using a damp sponge. I don't want to use a sponge on this. There's some grog in this clay. I wouldn't just like sit there and sponge edges, but just get them a little wet and then be able to use my finger. If I use a sponge, what it does is it just takes those fine particles away and leaves kind of a coarse edge. So just wetting it slightly so there's some lubrication for my fingers to manipulate those edges is one way that I play with getting rid of a freshly cut edge. Okay, what I've tried to do with this demonstration is to show you how you can utilize slabs fresh off the slab roller, off of your rolling pin, in a way that is a lot different than using a mold or using templates. Using templates with this technique also may help you visualize what a specific shape slab might do. Also, you can cut profiles off of the slab that are relevant to the template that you cut, and then it can actually dictate some of the shape that you get out of the slab. So a picture like this is not so easily clean. I can't get my hand down in there. Sometimes we sacrifice utility for aesthetic, and this may be one of those cases. Picture after I've done some slip work to it. Working on the surface later through the firing process may add more or obscure some of this too. So one other variation on working with loose slabs, I like to call it the pie shape. Taking a very small piece of pie out of a circle, you can bend it up and make a conical form, and I'm going to demonstrate that. Utilizing that along with making tubes, making other forms just with free slab work is a good way to play with forms that would go up and in, or have it go down and under. Finding an object that's already round is a good way to start out. You can do this technique with other shapes too, and I'll demonstrate what that looks like. But I'm going to use this old CD, cut around it. And then, as I said, I'm going to cut out a small piece of pie, as if I was on a diet or something. I'm going to find the middle, and to find the middle, if you want to be really exact, you can draw a line and try and dissect it and draw a line again and just kind of see if those pieces are of equal distance. You could even measure it if you want. But to find the actual center of this, that's one way if you want to be precise. And I'm going to just go ahead and put my mark and cut right on that mark. And I'm going to start out by cutting a little at a time. I know I can always cut a little way more if I don't get the cone shape I want. But just cutting out that small piece allows me to then bend this over, and I would then join that seam if I was happy with that cone. And that would be one way to think about it. It's a good way to make lids also, not just parts to the body of the piece, but also other parts. So I'm going to say I want it a little more drastic, and I don't want to cut a whole quarter out just yet, just so I can show you the difference. So cutting out a little bit more, and I may overlap that seam, is showing you that peak on that cone. If that's like a roof, the peak of the roof is getting steeper. And cut out just a little more shape. So I'm going to cut out the full quarter of that pie and show you what happens then. And this is almost like a martini glass, looking at that kind of shape. It's almost getting to that point. The bigger the cone, of course, would actually fit into the nice size martini glass. And of course the thickness of the clay, I'd probably use it a lot thinner if I was just going to use this as the drinking part of the vessel. So I'm going to cut out just a little bit more, just to show you, just going past that quarter point, what happens then. So that's just another maybe eighth of the pie, and this is showing you that the steepness there of this cone. So pretty simple idea. Again, it goes back to paper templates, and anything you could cut out of paper could then be translated into clay. So instead of just playing with the clay, if you wanted to repeat things over and over, you could think about maybe a paper template. Instead of using a CD, you could lay on our hardstock paper that might, be able to be used over and over again, and you could repeat this same cone over and over again. Okay, so affixing that seam, I have the options of overlapping it, and just actually showing that seam or overlapping it and smoothing in that area with some reductive work possibly. I also have that option of bringing this joint together right where the slab is cut. And so that's what I'm going to demonstrate. I may have to add a coil a little bit, but if that's going to be an interior seam to something that I was going to drink out of, I might try and get it as close to possible without adding any change in thickness to the cone. And I don't really want to manipulate this too much, but I have to use some pressure after I've scored and slipped that area. I have to use some pressure, and it's going to manipulate it quite a bit, but I can fettle it down, I can work it down with my fingers and smooth out that seam. I'm going to close it in on the inside like I did on the outside, and go back to that one tool I like a lot is this stiff brush, and it acts as an eraser down in like this point of the cone I can't get to, but of course my fingers are going to be much better to use in some ways. Not using very much water at all, and allowing them to be able to manipulate that clay and move that clay. Of course I can lay it against this table here, and I can use the flatness of the table to also kind of remove this seam, but further work the inside a little bit and try and have it flow there. Now, it might not be a problem that you have. You might think about that seam as part of the line in the piece. Okay, I've laid it on the table here, and I am going to work this seam now. Sometimes even rolling it might get that exterior seam to start to flatten out there. And I can work it further with a rib or my fettling knife. So there you have it, a real simple way to make a cone, and it can be done on virtually any scale that you can handle. And now I'm going to show you how to work with something that's not round and do a similar process. This is an Ishing tool. I'm going to use this to cut slabs. Got a blade on both sides here. I can adjust it to the actual size of the slab I'm going to want, and I can use it against a straight edge and get a pretty straight slab. So I'm thinking off of this cone to actually have a cylinder come off of there, maybe about 3 inches or so. Okay, I'm going to tighten that up. I'm going to use this straight edge now on the slab and draw this across. Could of course just kind of freehand it and just pull it, but I might zigzag too much. So this gives me that slab pretty instantly without having to measure it. So that's the benefit of using a tool like that. Now of course, just making marks on the clay and measuring out a distance, you can also do the same. This lip here, and have this actually be the top of this cone, off of the cone, and have this cylinder come off of there, and I'm going to have this as the lip to this. I've got somewhat of an idea of the diameter I want by looking at the actual cone. So I'm going to have that by me, and I'm going to take this and I'm going to roll it up. I have more clay than I need, but I'm going to take it up and I'm just going to roll it up into about that diameter that I'm going to look for. Sometimes I can then hold it close to there and say I need a little tighter. That. Say it's getting closer. And now I'm going to get a tool on the inside here, cut against it on an angle, so this angle here matches that angle there, and I can fit that seam together. Okay, this tool I have, that's just a stick basically, a piece of wood, but it's got a little bit of a curvature on it. So this is just a way that I can go ahead and cut this angle through both of these slabs and have something to kind of push against without manipulating the slab too much more. So I'm not going to use that, I'm not going to use that, and when this now comes together, that angle matches up pretty well, if you see that. Yeah, as I said about the diameter of the cone, it matches up really well with this. So now I'm going to score and get this kind of wet, and then do the same to the seam, get this seam together, and I'm going to flip this over, keeping this refined finished lip. On the other side, I'll be scoring down here, and I'll join this piece to that. Okay, refining the seam. There's the seam right now. What I've been doing here is I pushed it together from that side and from this side, and then I got in with this, again, a curved piece, and I used a fettling knife and I worked that seam. I fettled it up, I fettled it down, and I also worked it horizontally. So I'm going to work it a little bit more, show you what I mean, on an angle, meaning I'm taking some of the clay from here with pressure, moving it this way, and then sometimes on an angle that way. This is one way to close up a seam that's tight like that. Using this on the inside, of course I have something to press against. Working on the inside of the seam, I've pretty much just dragged this upward, and so now you see the interior of the seam there, close to being finished. The lip is the most important focal point on this, and so I'll really work this lip a lot more. And so I'm going to work that lip just with my fingers really damp, not really wet, but damp fingers. And so I'm going to maybe use a sponge a little, but I'm pretty much going to try and not use a sponge because I don't want any grog or heavier particles being brought to the lip where I'm going to put my lip against. So, okay, so I'll finish that off, and one of the things I like to do is on the bottom is to actually take that area and spray maybe a plastic bat down and then run it on that area so that area stays wet while I'm working on another part. So here you see what I mean by that. I have some water there, and you see how I can do that. It's another way to flatten an area out too. If you're ever trying to get the bottom of something even, you can do that, and eventually that slurry, it starts flattening it out. I did that with this part of the piece too, to actually do that, to flatten this area out more. But it's also keeping that area where I'm going to join to that moist until I'm ready to do that. Okay, a real simple way I'm thinking about making the stem by rolling the slab onto a dowel rod. Of course, with something this big in diameter, it could be actually a solid coil of clay. However, the structure of a solid coil compared to this, the shrinkage, sometimes cause cracks where you're joining it to the piece. So I've rolled it up on there, and I have this area here where it's now going to roll onto the existing clay here. I'm going to cut that to be just a little bit more than I need so it can overlap, and then I can do some reductive work on that seam once I get that together. Now I can use the pressure of the dowel rod in there. I don't want to get the dowel rod stuck in there, so I want to make sure that it's sliding in and out of that tube while I'm doing that. One way to do it is to actually use water on it and make it really slippery on the interior of this, but I don't really want it to get wet. I want to try and use it right off the bat. So I'm just going to take a dry wooden dowel and just keep turning it. If it starts to stick, then I just turn it slightly and it usually breaks itself free. Okay, so now I have the dowel rod on the inside against that seam, and I'm going to push down on both ends of the dowel rod and try and use pressure from the inside of this tube to seal that seam up there. And I may sometimes get on top of it like this and take a small paddle and use some pretty strong pressure to get that seam together. When you're paddling the clay, you're really manipulating those molecules and getting them tight onto one another. Alright, obviously I don't need this long of a length if I'm making a chalice or something. If I'm making some sculptural form with this, then of course length is something that you play with maybe. And so I'm just going to sled across it with this. Slowly get that honed up. Again, making sure that that dowel rod is sliding all the time. Okay, just for an example, I'm thinking about how you have this straightforward tube, pretty simple. You could leave it like that, or I found something that was in the shop here, just cardboard. You can think about finding other things that have texture on them. And since there's a dowel rod in there, I can feasibly roll this onto here and pick up that texture. I can push against it and I'm creating instant texture on the surface of this. So I'm going to play with that, roll across it a couple times, show you what that looks like. Of course, if you roll it on an angle, you're going to pull up some kind of linear quality that's going to somewhat spiral up that form too. Since that's an area that's going to be held, some surface tactile qualities to that can be nice to play with. Okay, it's pretty easy to cut a form off like this. If you lay your knife on there and slowly cut like that, it cuts it pretty even. If you wanted to use that technique on larger diameter cylinders with the same technique, you could think about how that could be several different pieces, or smaller diameter pieces. If you wanted to use it for a variety of things, not just the stem of something, you could feasibly just roll across it with your knife like that. And that way I've cut off these 1, 2, 3 units here. And you can measure it out and do that and stuff, but since you have this dowel rod on the inside, it makes it pretty easy to cut against it. Alright, the other thing that when you cut that way, you get a pretty flat surface. If you're careful, you have then that piece being able to sit pretty firmly on a flat area. You don't have to worry about having it higher over here and lower over there. Okay, I have the form pretty much fixed up on the interior and the exterior, and it's still upside down right now for me, for this form, but this possibly could be a way to make a jar. You could cut off here, make a flange on it, or cut it on an angle, or do a puzzle kind of lid, have a floor on it, and call it a jar. I'm going to go to this different step. I've again made this part, and that's going to go up here. But with this one, I'm looking at this. These areas here and here are both scored and very moist, ready to stick. You even see that it left a lot of clay, but that just marked that area. So I really need to score really well here, slip that up, and I'm going to attach that form to that. I just went back to that simple shape, that cone shape, and I've prepared that. I've actually made it as a hollow object. So of course a hollow object is going to need a hole, so I'm going to put the hole in, and that hole is going to transfer to there, which then I may choose to put a hole in the stem somewhere to allow the air out, or I may put a hole in the bottom of this, which I can then seal up later. You can see how I finished that part too. It's a hollow object, and again I said there's this hole. I was going to either put it in here or here. That will be an area that will be glazed shut in the final firing. So Goblets are certainly challenging to make. Proportions are something that you play with. Sometimes the height of this could be shorter or even taller. The volume of this could be more. Playing with those elements is very much like working with teapots and all the elements of the teapot. I like to talk about leather hard slabs, and there's a lot of different ways with working with both real wet slabs and leather hard slabs, where you can plan it out, or you can just go and just build stuff out of the slabs. So of course, building it, you have to have some kind of plan possibly, but I'd like to talk about the simplicity of using templates. This is just a cardboard template that I can use for 5 walls or 6 walls or 4 walls or 3 walls of a form this big, and then I could either build another form on top of that, throw a form, put it on there. So just a way to basically think about how a box is made up of so many different sides if you want them all the same. I could use this one for 2 sides, and then I could use longer ones for the other 2 sides, and I could have a rectangular form. So you have to think about how your templates work. And one thing I suggest is, anything you can put together with paper and the curvature of paper, you can get, obviously you can bend clay, cardstock, or stiff material like cardboard. Anything you can put together, you can use duct tape to loosely fit it together. You can get an idea of what you're doing. You can build somewhat of a maquette, or not a maquette, but an actual scale model that you can then take apart and use all those pieces to transform it into clay pieces that you put together to create that same form. So any scale, and then thinking about how elements might work together and how you put things together again in cardboard will then tell you how they may look. Then in clay, of course, the clay you're going to be able to manipulate quite a bit more than cardboard. In its plastic state, the variety of things that you'd be able to do to it is where you can take it from that model to an individual piece. So how you get into it with leather hard slabs, if you want them to stay stiff, it depends how hard you want them. Also like to say cheese hard. I learned that from somebody because a lot of people aren't really used to the stiffness of leather. But the curvature of a leather hard slab, you can curve it to some degree. But I'm just going to talk about like a basic box as though I was building it out of cardboard. So I've got these slabs here up to that point where they're at a pretty stiff consistency, and keeping them at that consistency during the process. So if it's taking me a while, if I have a lot of pieces, then I'm certainly going to keep some of those pieces covered in plastic while I'm working on others. Like this is the lid, or the top of the form. And so I wanted to make sure that was covered up, and this is the bottom of the form, and those will be the last things I'm going to be putting on. So I'm going to make 4 walls. What I've done is I've rolled out the slabs. For this piece, little around 1/4 of an inch thick, and one of the keys is, again, things dry from the edges, and so I don't want to cut out the exact shape that I want right away. I want to cut out a shape that's about 1/2 inch or so. I don't want to be too wasteful with the clay, have to reclaim all that clay, but I want to cut out a shape that's around 1/2 inch or so larger than the form. Okay, with this template, I've got 2 options. I can cut exactly where the template is, like this. Cut off that excess clay, again, so I have a fresh piece of clay and real fresh edge on that piece of clay. Or I can think about actually cutting a 45-degree angle off of that template, so I have the sides coming together in such a manner that they have more surface area to connect, is one of the keys. But what I do, instead of cutting this edge and this edge where I'm going to attach the next piece to, instead of cutting that on a 45-degree angle, you can take a board that's already cut on a 45, and of course it depends on if you're having 4 sides, and a 45-degree angle is what you're looking for to have these match up and be a box, right? You have to look at angles depending on the geometry of the piece. But if I had a piece of wood cut at a 45, I could lay it on here and slide that knife across that and get an exact 45. Well, I don't do that. I actually take it and I just score it on an angle. You can see that on this edge here. So I'm going to do that to all four sides of this box. So on each side, I'm not going to do the bottom or the top this way, although you can do that. So I'm going to get a 45 on all the sides, and then I'll slip it and I'll put it together. And one thing you got to look out is all of this stuff when you're scoring is winding up here, and if you have a nice smooth surface as I do with this slab, I don't want to lay it down on there. So that's one of those precautions you have to take. If you're looking for that 45, if you have one of these scoring ribs like this, you actually lay this part down flush. This area here is going to give you a pretty good angle for that too, instead of eyeballing it. So that's one of the things that you can look at, is like if you're actually laying that flush, you're getting this kind of 45-degree angle right here. Alright, now I'm going to slip them all and then fit them together. Alright, I've got all four sides here slipped and put together, and you see how the slip is squishing out of all those seams, so I've been pretty liberal with it. I'm going to go back and reduce some of that slip and then start using pressure this way and this way on each seam to close up those seams and fix them further. And then the next step would be to be adding a small coil to reinforce those four seams. What I do for the seams sometimes is paddle them down, and this is the pressure that I could get with my fingers, but may manipulate that clay too much. And with this paddle I can then sled up and sled across and kind of get close to finishing it if I want a really tight seam there. So a real tight, rigid seam can also then be honed up slightly more by taking a fettling knife or a smooth rib and really honing up that edge if you really want a sharp edge there. Okay, I've refined all the joints now, and now my next step before putting the bottom and the top on this form is to roll out a coil about a 1/16 of an inch, not too large, just enough to add a gusset in here to reinforce this seam. Okay, I'm working on this last seam. I'm going to lay this coil in, and I start down at the bottom after I lay it in there. I've scored a little in there and slipped, and I'm using just my finger pressure to kind of bounce it into that corner slightly, and I kind of pinch off this part, and it's just kind of worked in there a little now. So I start back at the bottom, work my way up. On larger pieces this is pretty important. On smaller pieces it's not really a necessity, and so it depends on what you're doing, but it really is beneficial to reinforce that seam. If you're going to spend a lot of time on that piece, you want it to actually have a crack. Now I'm going to work on the bottom here and score that and put a slab on the bottom and do a similar thing with the coils. Okay, this seam on the bottom is the last one I can actually work with a coil until I cut the lid off. If I was using this form just as a form under another form, then that top seam would be difficult to get a coil on. Okay, one thing that I like to do is to score, really liberally score, and slip this area here. And then how do I know where to score here? I don't want to score this whole area. I could measure it out and score exactly where it's going to meet up. Or what I like is the outline that this slip is going to make on here. So I'm going to put that down on there. I'm not going to press too hard, but that's going to then be something I can lift up, try and keep it in that curve, and you can see here where it's shown kind of an outline where I'm going to score and slip this slab. Once it's on there, there's a couple ways to play with that. Of course, just manipulation with your hands, but you can use the paddle all the way around there and work that area. And I've left that extra a bit hanging around here. Before I cut it, I'm gonna work that down with some pressure. Another thing is a lot of people use these rollers. This one's made in the USA. What do you know? It's a pastry and pizza roller, and these work really well too, because you're applying pressure just to where you want. Really, it works out pretty well, so you don't cave it in. Now, if you have a volume up here that you really want to keep a higher volume on, you can stuff it with plastic, stuff the whole form with plastic or foam, and that'll hold that volume. And having finished everything off pretty much to the point where I want it, I'm going to have to put a hole in it somewhere as it starts to dry a little. And of course this is just a box, so what do you do with it then? I'm thinking about all the varieties of ways you could of course cut it off right here evenly all the way around and add a flange to the interior, so a slab of clay that might be attached to the lid or to the body, and then seat up inside the lid or vice versa. Or a puzzle lid, thinking about the way you cut it off, very much like a pumpkin, it fits back together. Or just as a box with another form. Now if you're working sculpturally, internal structure might be worked into it too for a variety of reasons, depending on the weight on top of it or the scale of the object too. This box form is finished, and it's more in that puzzle lid format, so the forms that are on the surface of it actually then fit together as fingers would into a glove. You can see some close-ups of it here, and there's actually some forms working inside of the forms too. This one here is from that same template again. So one thing about templates is very much like molds, just utilizing a template and making the same thing over and over, of course, is pretty boring. So you can work a variety of different things from that same mold or that same template, but still within that same format.